At the same time, the patriotic section was handing out defeats to the Apaches in southern Arizona in the year 1832. Another Mexican captain by the name of Jose Ignacio Ronquillo dealt a significant and violent blow to the Apaches under Fuerte around southern New Mexico. Yet again, in that year, the Apaches fought the Mexicans near Santa Rita del Cobre, at the base of the beautiful Mogollon Mountains. The place the Apaches called Mezcal Extends Upward, a place many Apaches of these bands believed was a place that life began after the flood. I don't believe there was supposed to be a crushing defeat at Santa Rita del Cobre, but 4 Apache warrior youths jumped the gun, and during some peace proceedings between Fuerte and some other chiefs and this Captain Ronquillo, they made a mistake. After some brief skirmishes in and around the mountains, white flags were raised as usual on both sides. Talks were had, documents were about to be signed, prisoners exchanged, and then these 4 Apache youth, they charged the Mexican horses and they lanced one of them. Ronquillo had no choice but to press his attack. He was ready for such treachery, so when it arrived, he acted. The ensuing battle lasted from noon until sunset. It was May, so for 7 or 8 hours that battle lasted. The Apaches and the Mexicans fought hard, and 22 Apaches were killed and 50 were wounded. And on the other side, 3 Mexicans had been killed. It was quite a humiliating and humbling defeat for Fuerte, who was not yet Mangas Coloradas, but it was a humbling defeat for Fuerte and the Apaches. One Apache band, the Carrizaleño band, would eventually disappear due to this battle. Their members would just be adopted by other Apache bands because they lost so many. A formal treaty would be signed in August of 1832 between the state of Chihuahua and the bands of Chiricahua Apache. In the proceedings, Fuerte was named general, and he was put in charge of his Apaches, who were to stay in the Mogollon Mountains region without being given rations. So they were to sustain themselves, and they were not allowed to raid. I mean, as Sweeney puts it, the peace that came from the truce was only temporary, and it had little chance to succeed, obviously. Another tenet of the truce was that the headquarters of the Chiricahua Apache was moved from far-off Janos to right on their doorstep at Santa Rita del Cobre. One reason was so that the Mexican leaders could keep a better eye on Fuerte and the Chiricahua Apaches. But another reason was to stop the trading of stolen loot from Mexico to the Americans, who would often trade the Apaches new American guns and ammo for the cheap, stolen Mexican goods. One of these main American traders was a man we will certainly talk about a lot about, and a man I have mentioned before, that man being James Kierker. The Chiricahua under Fuerte would keep the peace for less than 6 months. By early 1833, they were already raiding into Mexico once again, and that year alone, over 200 Norteños would be murdered by the Apaches. Mexicans could not work their fields, mine their ore. They couldn't travel from one place to the next. A decade-long war between Fuerte and the Mexicans had begun, but it was about to get a whole lot worse, and more tragic. In 1834, one of Mangus's rivals, rival in a sense of friendly fellow Apache war chief, not enemy, but one of Mangus's rivals was a respected Apache named Tutije, and he was captured near Santa Rita del Cobre, and then he was paraded around Arizpe in Sonora. And then he was executed. His execution would further inflame the warring Apaches. A year later, Elias and his La Sección Patriótica repeated their 1832 success with another raid on the Apaches near the present-day Arizona-New Mexico border. They would kill 10 to 15 Apaches and would wound quite a few more. Elias was rather surprised at the Apaches' fighting ability, though. He could tell that something had clearly changed. He, of course, blamed the new tactics on the influence of the Anglo-Americans, and he was probably onto something. In 1836, at Santa Rita del Cobre, one Apache woman and 2 men were killed by Mexican civilians in cold blood. Apparently, the Apaches were beaten, stabbed, speared, and shot to death. But 1837 would be the real turning point in the war between the Mexicans and the Apaches. Despite the sound of his name, Juan Jose Compa was an Apache. He was a Mimbres Apache who lived near Janos, and he had been selected in his youth to be a priest in the Catholic Church. He was probably the first Apache to do so. He became educated. He learned Spanish. He was a quote-unquote good Indian. Despite multiple sources saying his father was murdered by Mexicans, which made him into this ravenous beast, Sweeney says Juan Jose's father actually died of natural causes in 1794. At that point, Juan Jose Compa's brother became the leader of the family group, not of the tribe, just of the family group. Again, regardless of multiple other sources saying that the Compas were chiefs, they never attained that status among the Apache. It was just that Juan Jose Compa, he had the ability to speak Spanish and Apache, which elevated his status among the Mexicans. It also helped his status with the Mexicans that Juan Jose Compa was a peaceful-leaning Apache. The Apaches didn't really even trust Juan Jose Compa. He had essentially become an outsider, and the Apaches did not trust outsiders. One Mexican authority named Colonel Justiniani even said of him that the Apaches, quote, did not respect him, nor did they pay any attention to him unless it was in the conferences with Mexicans where he had to talk to the chiefs. End quote. It's only after his massacre did Juan Jose Compa and his legend grow to the inaccurate versions that filled a few of the books I used for this series. Many of the books said that Juan Jose set fire to the Mexican countryside, that he made war on all the Mexicans he could find. But the reality is, he was brokering peace treaties between the Apaches and the Mexicans. He was trying to persuade Fuerte to stop attacking the Mexicans. He even told the aforementioned Justiniani that he himself, Juan, would force his small band to go to war against Fuerte's band if he did not make peace. Of course, they would never actually fight each other, and Fuerte would win. Juan was just saying what he needed to say to the Mexicans, but he was not the war-hungry great Chiricahua Apache leader that some of the older books claimed he was. Regardless, his death is rather significant. By 1836, so a year after Sonora had begun their policy of scalp bounties, where the state would pay hunters of men 100 pesos for the scalp of an adult male Apache, 50 pesos for an adult female, and 25 pesos for an Apache child's scalp. By 1836, the Chiricahua Apaches were devastating Sonora. They were setting fire to every hacienda and town and pueblo they came across. The warring factions of Apaches were killing militiamen and their captains. They were stealing horses and mules. They were intercepting mail, reading said mail, and then using the intelligence in that mail to plan even further raids, traps, ambushes, and military actions. Now, it did seem that the Apaches were using Compa's ability to read Spanish in these pursuits. It is true, though, that eventually Juan Jose Compa, he kind of realized he could do nothing to stop the warring Apaches, who were led by Fuerte. It is said that by 1836, he was indeed amongst them, probably even fighting with Fuerte and the Chiricahuas. But again, the Apaches' hatred at this time was directed solely at the Mexicans. The Americans, whom they traded with frequently, they were no bother. Apparently, Juan Jose Compa was even very good friends with an American named James Johnson, or alternatively John Johnson. I saw both. Either way, it is the most American name ever. Johnson was a fur trapper who also owned and operated a trading post in Moctezuma, which is in Sonora, and he ran that trading post with his Mexican wife. Johnson would gladly accept the stolen Mexican loot that Juan Jose Compa and the other Apaches brought him. And Johnson was seemingly on good terms with the Apache chief, Juan Jose, and apparently even called him a friend. Although not friends enough to deny a bribe from the Sonoran government to betray and kill Juan Jose. This bribe, though, in the story, it did not escape the intelligent eyes of the Apache man who eventually would intercept a letter from the Sonoran government to his friend that outlined the very bribe and the scheme. So, Juan Jose Compa even confronted Johnson about the troubling artifact, but Johnson dismissed the letter and told Juan not to worry, we're friends, and that he would never betray him. Quick cut to only a few months later in 1837, when Johnson rode near Juan Jose Compa's camp in the Animas Mountains of southern New Mexico, and with them were a couple of rough-and-tumble Missourians by the names of Gleason and Eames. He also had 15 other Anglos and 5 Mexicans with him. A few of the books I read cover this infamous and upsetting betrayal. Actually, all of them do. But Sweeney's is the version I trust the most. And in his version, he never mentions that Johnson and Compa knew each other prior to what's about to take place. And he also doesn't mention that Johnson was asked to even specifically kill Juan Jose Compa. It just so happens that John, or James Johnson, Sweeney calls him John, it just so happened that John Johnson came upon Juan Jose Compa and his companions during a planned murderous foray into Apache territory. It seems as though Johnson was going to collect some bounties regardless of whose head the scalps came from. The two parties, Johnson's and the Chiricahua Apaches, they met on April 20th, 1837. And for 2 days, the 20th and the 21st, the groups traded in goods and friendship, and all seemed to be going pretty well, until the morning of the 22nd. I will now quote a vivid retelling of the events that is from Frank C. Lockwood's The Apache Indians. So it may not be 100%, but it is a great story, albeit a little sad. Upon their arrival, the trader told Juan Jose that he had brought along a sack of piñole as a present for the women and children. The sack was taken from the back of the pack animal, and a man was designated by the chief to take charge of the distribution. At once, all the Indians, men, women, and children, gathered about the sack. That was what Johnson desired and expected. Concealed under an aparejo on the back of one of the trader's mules was a blunderbuss that had been brought for just this opportunity. It was loaded with balls, slugs, and bits of chain. Not quite so serviceable as the machine gun of the modern American racketeer, but well adapted to its fiendish purpose. Meantime, Gleason, under the pretext that he wanted to buy a fine saddle mule of Juan Jose's, had drawn the chief a little distance aside where the mule was standing. The plan was for Gleason to shoot the unsuspecting chief with his pistol at the same time that Johnson fired the blunderbuss into the crowd assembled about the bag of piñole. The scheme was instantly executed. The blunderbuss wrought cruel havoc among the crowd, and Gleason shot Juan at the same time. Wounded, but not unto death, the chief cried out, "Don Santiago, come to my rescue!" At the same time, he clinched with Gleason and threw him to the ground. And now, with drawn knife, he was poised ready to stab him. Johnson came over, and Juan Jose said, "For God's sake, save my life. I can kill your friend, but I don't want to do it." In reply, Johnson shot him. He sank down dead on top of his prostrate foe. Thus perished that fine specimen of a man. I knew the man well, and I can vouch for the fact that he was a perfect gentleman as well as a kind-hearted one. This quotation and the whole account of the tragedy as related above I have drawn from Benjamin D. Wilson's unpublished diary, Observations on Early Days in California and New Mexico. Wilson was a trapper in New Mexico at the time of the betrayal and murder of Juan Jose. He was near the scene of the tragedy at the time and met members of the Eames party who escaped. Wilson later moved to California, became the first American mayor of Los Angeles, was elected to the state senate, and became so prominent in California that Mount Wilson was named for him, as were, also, civic objects in Pasadena. We must therefore accept his account of this terrible early outrage upon Apaches by Americans as authentic and trustworthy. End all quotes. I have no idea how authentic and trustworthy the account is, but the end result remains the same. At least 20 Apaches were murdered, possibly 25. And all those that were murdered had been scalped. A bounty was to be collected after all. Among the dead were Chief Juan Jose Compa, his brother Juan Diego Compa, and 2 other chiefs, as well as 2 of Mangas Coloradas' wives. Because yes, our man Fuerte, he was there. Sweeney writes this of his presence at the ill-fated massacre. Although contemporary accounts do not mention the presence of either Fuerte or Mangas Coloradas, Apache oral history places him at the scene of the massacre. The informants of Eve Ball told her that Mangas Coloradas was present and declared that after the first volley he had grabbed a baby and fled the scene. Only later, they said, did he realize that, quoting the informant, the baby he carried with him was his son. End quote. Unfortunately, 2 of his 4 wives were not as lucky, for they fell victims of Johnson's insidious chicanery. End all quotes. For Johnson's chicanery, his trading post would be burned to the ground. But he would die of old age in California. His treachery went unpunished in this life. Maybe he became a bear a few times after his death, though. After the massacre, Fuerte would never be the same, and he would go on to earn his nickname among the Mexicans, Red Sleeves. A round of terrible fury and vengeance was about to rain down upon the Norteños because of this unprecedented attack and scalping. As Sweeney puts it, it's one thing to defeat your enemy on the battlefield. It's a whole other thing to defeat them by trickery and cowardice. Having a group of women and children huddle under false pretenses around like fake gifts before you blast them away, and then you scalp the lot of them with the ears still attached. The Apaches could sense the tides turning. War was about to give way to annihilation. Immediately after the mourning period ended, the Apaches under Fuerte struck back. One Chiricahua Apache, much later, would tell anthropologist Morris Opler that after a massacre like this, the Apaches, quote, they go after anything, a troop of cavalry, a town, they are angry. They fight anyone to get even, end quote. A wagon train was ambushed while en route from El Paso to Santa Fe. All 12 men were killed. 22 fur trappers known simply as the Kemp Party were all killed by Fuerte and the Apaches days later. And during the looting of the Kemp Party, Fuerte became Red Sleeves. Sweeney writes, quote, it was after the fight with Kemp's party, according to legend, that Mangas donned a shirt with bright red sleeves and thus took on his new name, probably more of a nickname, and became Kandazis Tlishin, or Red Sleeves, end quote. I like to think his name's Red Sleeves on account of all the blood he collected on him, but that works too. Curiously, a few weeks after the massacre, the man quoted above by Lockwood, the man who would later become LA's first American mayor, that man Benjamin D. Wilson, he was captured by Mangas Coloradas and his Apache warriors. Wilson, he knew nothing of the Johnson massacre at the time of his capture. So it stands to reason that the only way he learned of the massacre was by Mangas after he was captured. He probably learned of the events from Mangas Coloradas himself. Lockwood said that Wilson learned of the treachery by something known as the Eames Party, but I believe he learned of the horrible events by Mangas, as Mangas escorted him personally from captivity among his own people to safety. Here's Wilson's direct quote of the events surrounding his capture and release. Everything we had was taken from us. We were marched up to the Apache camp. There we were given to ascertain that something terrible had happened between the Apaches and Americans, and that the young warriors were determined to sacrifice us. We expressed our astonishment at the changed conduct of the Apaches, from whom we had ever before received many evidences of friendly feelings. In camp that night, the Indians kept up a war dance to the east of the wigwam where Chief Mangas kept us confined. The old chief was opposed to our being sacrificed, as he had said that he had received many favors from Americans. and believed it was to the interest of his people to keep up the amicable relations existing all this time. Our party at this time was reduced to 3 men. Mangas told us that he had been doing his best to dissuade his men from destroying us, but unsuccessfully. Finally, at a late hour of the night, Mangas came in greatly excited and said that he had to return to his warriors and one of us must leave, as it was the only one he could save. I asked my men what we should do. One, named Maxwell, had a sprained ankle and could not walk. The other, named Tucker, was kind of invalid. So it was concluded that I should go. I caught up a small buffalo robe and threw it upon my shoulder. The Indians had stripped me of all my clothing, and left. End quote. So, he caught a lucky break there. But, at the end of the story, Tucker and Maxwell, they also get released by Mangas. Because for now, he really did not hate or want to make war against the Americans. His beef, as always, was with the Mexicans, and it was upon them that he released his righteous vengeance. The massacre by Johnson would start the avenging war of the Apaches against the Mexicans. 1837 saw both Chihuahua and Sonora attacked constantly by Mangas Coloradas and his warring Apaches. Towns across the north were attacked. Towns with names like Cumpas, Huepac, Fronteras, Galeana, Casas Grandes, Ramos, Janos, El Carmen, Bafisbe, Santa Cruz. The situation for the beleaguered Mexicans was dire. They lacked firearms, and when they had them, they lacked ammunition. Towns were abandoned, horses stolen, cattle stolen, funds for fighters were non-existent. Plans of military excursions were constantly abandoned. Retaliation by the Mexicans was rare. In 1838, Mangas Coloradas would finally force the closure of the mines at Santa Rita del Cobre, which was a great success for he and his people. He turned the place into a ghost town. Although, despite both Apache oral tradition and Anglo writings of the closure of the mines, the Apaches did not in fact massacre every man, woman, and child that left the town. That tall tale was possibly started by the unreliable narrator I mentioned earlier, Criminy. Paul Andrew Hutton in Apache Wars writes of this period well. He wrote, quote, "The desert now reclaimed the untilled fields. Cattle, sheep, mules, and goats wandered free only to fall prey to the great packs of wolves and coyotes that trailed the Apache raiding parties, just as the raven shadows the predator on his rounds. Skeletons lined the roads, littered the burned haciendas, and were picked clean by scavengers in deserted villages. It was a perfect reign of terror." End quote. To make matters even worse for the Norteños, also in 1838, a bloody and expensive civil war erupted in Sonora between two rival caudillos for complete control of the state. And that ill-timed civil war would last quite a long time. While doing the research, every couple of paragraphs or every couple of months, the leader of the state of Sonora would change hands between these two warring individuals. One was liberal, one was conservative, one was backed by Santa Anna, the president, and the other was, well, not. It's interesting if you want to learn about it, but there's not enough time in this already extremely long episode to go into it. But one time, one of the brief winners, he won the contest, and he was, quote-unquote, perfidious politician named Gandara. In 1839, he would finally stage a retaliatory strike in the heart of Apacheria. And he would score a victory, too. The swift battle took place in the Mimbres Valley, and 17 Apaches would be killed by Gandara. Meanwhile, the governor in Chihuahua, the brother of the head of the Sonoran forces, Jose Maria Elias Gonzalez, a man named Simon Elias Gonzalez. There's a lot of Eliases in this episode. Even I got confused when reading. But Simon Elias Gonzalez, he would bring in one of the most interesting and unsavory characters of this era to teach the Apaches a lesson. The man would be none other than Don Santiago Kirker, better known as James Kirker. I actually mentioned Kirker in my Rise of the Kachinas episode, when I said, quote, Kirker was James Kirker, an Irishman employed by the governor of Chihuahua to do questionable things to the Mexican Indians. But that's unimportant right now. End quote. Well, he's important now. James Kirker was about the same age as Mangas Coloradas, except Kirker was born in Ireland, not New Mexico. At 16, he left Ireland because he did not want to be drafted into the Royal Navy. But once in America, rather ironically, or maybe on purpose, he would end up becoming a quote-unquote legal American pirate, and he would subsequently raid British warships during the War of 1812. After the war, the Irishman met a woman, they had a son, and then he abandoned them and headed to Missouri. Then, in 1822, Kirker would join the William Henry Ashley fur trading expedition. I also talked about him and his expeditions in the Black Pioneers episode when I mentioned Moses Black Harris and Jim Beckworth. So Kirker was also on that expedition, which headed towards the Rocky Mountains. Once in them beautiful mountains, Kirker stayed until 1824, at which point he huffed it down south to southern New Mexico. For the next 10 years, Kirker would spend the winters trapping beaver, but beginning in 1826, he became employed by the mines in Santa Rita del Cobre. His main job was escorting wagon trains of copper from the mines to Chihuahua. By the 1830s, though, it was clear to the Mexican officials that Kirker was trading illicit guns and ammo for stolen goods and mules with the Apache at Santa Rita, which put Kirker in direct contact with Mangas Coloradas. And he apparently knew him well. Although Mangas, according to Sweeney, would, quote, eventually develop a particular disdain for Kirker, end quote. And you're about to find out why. Despite Mangas Coloradas' disdain for Kirker, in 1835 it appears that the Irishman, he would actually occasionally accompany the Apache on raids into Mexico. Lieutenant Colonel and head of the Sonoran military, Jose Maria Elias Gonzalez, he even suspected Kirker of training the Apaches, which was leading to the superior abilities of the Apaches to make war, which the other Elias recognized that I mentioned earlier. See, too many Eliases. He's not even the last Elias I'm going to introduce. In 1837 and 1838, Kirker probably again accompanied Mangas Coloradas and his Apaches on raids deep into Sonora. But by 1839, Kirker had switched sides, and he was now hunting Apache for the Chihuahua government, specifically Apache scalps. Kirker was the perfect man to run this sort of operation, too. Even if he had a bounty on his head set by the Mexican government for selling guns to the Apaches, he didn't mind. And apparently they let that slide so that he could accomplish his new goal. Kirker had been amongst the Apaches for a decade. He knew the territory. He knew where their camps were. He knew the Apaches. He even knew Mangas Coloradas, the general, as the Mexicans called him. Sweeney calls Kirker a, quote, opportunistic and pragmatic man usually prepared to take the side most advantageous to him. This time, the advantage was in Chihuahuan pesos. End quote. So Kirker and his right-hand man, who was a mixed-blood French and Shawnee Indian from Ohio, named Spybuck, which is just a fantastic name. But Kirker and his 6-foot-tall Indian friend Spybuck recruited a bunch of unsavory characters, and they agreed to be paid around 100,000 pesos. Which, pesos, right? How much could that be? It's just pesos. Well, at the time, that would have been equivalent to 100,000 American dollars. The two currencies were about equal. It was an offer, as Paul Andrew Hunt suggests, that Kirker could not refuse. The day after Christmas, 1839, Kirker and his men left Chihuahua City for Apacheria. It would be only a few weeks before he found his first success. In January of 1840, Kirker and his group of other Indians, Mexicans, and Anglos, they all headed towards the Janos area. When once there, they surprised the people of one of Mangas Coloradas' very good friends and fellow chief by the name of Pisago Cabezon. 50 miles north of Janos, Kirker and his scalpers killed 10 Apache warriors and 5 Apache civilians, and captured 20 others. Pisago Cabezon was not present during the attack because he was in Janos proper, but once he received word, he realized he couldn't retaliate. He couldn't do the Apache revenge because Kirker and the Mexicans and the Americans, they had 20 prisoners. Unsure of how to proceed, Pisago Cabezon asked Mangas Coloradas for his advice. And meanwhile, Kirker went back to Chihuahua City with the prisoners to collect his reward. Not long afterwards, though, Kirker and his 100 unruly men traveled the countryside again in search of more scalps. They'd find them on May 8th, when they surprised a small group of Apaches. They killed 6 men, captured 13 women and children, took 121 horses, and 4 barrels of whiskey. In retaliation, what was most likely Mangas Coloradas and his warring Apaches, they attacked a community deep within the Mexican Sierra Madres and killed 27 Mexicans. After that, the new Chihuahuan governor canceled Kirker's contract in favor of the Chihuahua State's militia. It's also very possible that the governor got the message that the Apaches sent by attacking so deep into Mexico. Or this policy didn't just anger the Apaches, but also angered all of the Indians in the northern frontiers of Mexico. After all, a scalp with black hair is a scalp with black hair, whether it came from an Apache, an O'odham, or even a Mexican. Those with less or no morals found it quite easy to bring in just any old scalp with dark hair and say, "Look, this was once on an Apache's head, now pay me." So the policy was scrapped for now. This is not the last we will hear of Kirker, by the way. Here is a quote from Sweeney. What Mangas possessed more than any other Chiricahua leader, at least from 1842 to 1857, was a self-confidence, bordering on arrogance, that, like a magnet, attracted fighting men from every Chiricahua band for incursions into Sonora. He was a cerebral leader, an organizer, planner, and diplomat, who led by actions, reputation, demonstrated intellect, and impressive stature. End quote. I had not planned on making Mangas Coloradas the key character of this episode. But not only does his life mirror the time frame I had planned on talking about, but he is such a main actor in the vital events of this Mexican period when the Americans are entering the scene. Not to mention, he's just so dang interesting. I mean, just picture a 6-foot-tall, 7-strong, older Indian just leading warriors into battle. It's just incredible. Besides being such a great warrior and leader, he lived in the most beautiful of places, which are the Mogollon Mountains. He met so many interesting people. I mean, Kit Carson, just to name one of them. He had 4 wives, although 2 were murdered by Johnson. And he had up to 15 children. And his children would also go on and do incredible things for the Apaches. Mangas loved his family, and later American officials would record how other Apaches regarded the Mangas Coloradas clan as Apache aristocracy, and they were aristocracy. One of his daughters wed a Navajo chief. Another daughter married Cochise, for goodness sakes. Other children married chiefs and leaders of a whole host of other Apache bands to the east and west of the Mogollons. So, Mescalero and Coyotero. Many of his sons gained prominent leadership positions after Mangas' death, especially his youngest son, Mangas, without the Coloradas. That is the only time I mention Mangas, his son. Otherwise, it would just get confusing. In 1842, after years of death and destruction, many Apache leaders, some of whom had children in the custody of the Mexicans, it suggests they were forced to do this, but many Apache leaders signed a peace deal with Chihuahua. One core component of the treaty was that rations would return to the Apaches who signed it. This treaty was actually quite successful, and it would result in 2 years of increased peace, although not complete peace. Mangas had not signed the deal after all, and he was a warrior chief, and he would never forgive the Mexicans for killing 2 of his wives, even if it were Americans that carried it out. During this time, he'd keep up the heat on Sonora, and he would force even more residents to flee. At the same time, he was using his ties with the other tribes, like the Navajos and the Western Apaches, to keep the heat turned up on both New Mexico and other areas of Mexico, respectively. But it had been a decade of brutal war, death, fire, treachery, chicanery. Everyone on both sides were tired. Not to mention, one of the factions in that long-lasting civil war in Sonora, they had temporarily won, and the winner was threatening to take his successful troops north to completely beat the Apaches for good. So on March 31st, 1843, Mangas did the unthinkable. He signed a peace treaty with the Mexicans, specifically with the state of Chihuahua. Sweeney writes of this momentous event, quote, "The agreement was typical of past treaties. In essence, both sides would cease hostilities and agree to a most sincere peace. Each consented to release their captives, and the Apaches agreed to assist Mexican troops against enemy forces. In return, Monterde would issue rations. The Apaches unanimously elected Mangas Coloradas to serve as general. He would be the leader responsible for maintaining control of his people. It would be a position that he took seriously." End all quotes. Monterde was Jose Mariano Monterde, the governor of Chihuahua. He was the same age as Mangas at 50 years old. And he too, like Mangas, was a military man, a lifelong military man. Although he was in Chihuahua, he was from Mexico City, DF. He was a man with a quote-unquote impeccable reputation, and he left Chihuahua City to personally meet with the general of the Apaches, Mangas Coloradas. Of course, keeping the peace wasn't easy, and only weeks later, a raiding party that most likely was led by one of Mangas's own sons, that raiding party hit El Paso, and then another one hit Janos. But the raiding party that struck Janos were told by Mangas Colorado himself to return the stolen goods they'd taken. He wanted to keep the peace. This interaction of Mangas telling his men to give the stuff back was even witnessed by Mexican military officials. And then, Mangas began a series of even more unthinkable actions. He was going to make peace with his enemy Sonora. Finally. Well, that was the plan. At least until the Norteños of Sonora royally screwed that up. After a raid on Fronteras by warring Apaches, 7 peaceful Chiricahua Apache that happened to be at the fort of Fronteras, they assisted the Mexican military in pursuing the culprits, who were probably coyoteros. But for some unknown reason, at some point during the pursuit, the Mexicans pointed their guns at their Apache allies and pulled the trigger, killing 6 of them. The 7th ran to Apacheria and spread word of the depredation like wildfire. Over in Chihuahua, the peace was already crumbling, and it was made worse when the governor realized he couldn't keep up the rations he had promised to the Apache. Part of the problem was the lack of provisions that was promised. Part of the problem was that the fields that needed to be tended to in order to get the food that was necessary for the rations, they had been left unattended on account of the dangers that the constant Apache raids presented. So the Apaches' past raids on the Mexicans prevented the Apaches from currently getting the rations they needed from the Mexican government in order to, in the future, not raid the Mexicans. Peace seemed hopeless. But peace with Chihuahua for now it lasted. Peace with Sonora That was an impossibility. Sweeney writes of this, quote, "Beginning in late 1843, the Chiricahua launched several war parties against Sonora, many led by Mangas Coloradas and the venerable Pisago Cabezon, which increased in severity almost monthly through early 1845. This gruesome cycle of revenge and retaliation characterized the mid-1840s. Many innocent people would fall on both sides, victims of an Apache arrow or lance, a Mexican machete or musket ball. Mangas Coloradas would never again consider making peace with Sonora, and it would be 7 long years before he would even contemplate another agreement with Chihuahua." End quote. Rather than continue with the violent details, gruesome, gritty details of this blood feud between Sonora and the Chiricahua Apaches, between Elias Gonzalez and Mangas Coloradas in the years of 1840, I'll just sum it up with Elias Gonzalez and his Sonoran troops inflicted many wounds and deaths upon the Apaches, but they were mostly of the peaceful Apaches near the Presidios. In response, Mangas led the warring Apaches on violent reprisals deep into Sonora. In response to that, Elias would raid the Apaches in Chihuahua. Meanwhile, the Sonoran Civil War continued as the Mexicans killed each other. The Mexicans also fought at this time against the Papagos, the Yaquis, and the Western Apaches. The Mexican Secretary of State in 1844 said about this situation and the Apaches, he said, quote, "They belong to that indigenous race that did not receive even one of those weak rays of light that existed in the continent before the conquest introduced European civilization." He goes on to say, quote, "These tribes maintained with the Spanish a war of 300 years' duration, forever marked by deeds of horror and cruelty." End quote. These deeds of horror and cruelty were on both sides, and they would continue. The northern streams of Mexico ran with blood. The vultures never hungered. The god of war never slept. I said I was going to sum it up, but I cannot skip over that illegal raid into Chihuahua by Elias and his 600 Sonoran and federal troops. This action would severely inflame the war that Mangas Coloradas at this time described as being, quote, "It would be war to the knife," end quote. 80 Apaches would be killed during the raid that saw Elias cross over in Chihuahua from Sonora illegally and surround Janos. The victims were mostly women and children, while 30 Apaches were captured and taken prisoner. Many of these dead or captured Apaches were friends and relatives of Mangas. One survivor of Elias Gonzalez's raid claimed the Mexicans killed quite a few children by, quote, "beating them against rocks," end quote. After the raid, every single Chiricahua band was officially once again at war with Sonora. And unofficially, they were at war with Chihuahua yet again as well. In 1844, the number of raids on that Mexican state totaled 10. In 1845, Chihuahua would suffer 218 Apache raids, from 10 scattered raids to 218 in 1 year. Peace, it seems, had bled out. It is now time to bring back Kirker, Carson, and to introduce y'all to Goyakla. You may know him better as Geronimo. In late 1845, Mexican Norteño officials organized 340 men, including Kirker and 30 of his mercenaries. They would do what they were hired to do, and they would raid Apache settlements, and they would kill Indians, and they would take scalps. But they were just getting started. In July of 1846, Kirker, Spybuck, and 24 other mercenaries would leave Chihuahua City for the town of Galiena, and there they would put an insidious plan into motion that the Chiricahua Apaches would never forget. It made Johnson's massacre look like T-ball. Kirker convinced the Mexicans to reach out to the nearby Choconin and Nehetni Chiricahuas and offer them a seat at the table for a peace treaty and a feast. On July 6th, the Chiricahuas arrived. The feast was laid out by the Mexican hosts, the alcohol was poured freely, a party was had. And then the Apaches passed out. I debated on whether I should read this or not. It is horrific stuff. This is from Sweeney. In the early morning of July 7, 1846, Kirker's barbaric party massacred the inebriated Chiricahwas in their sleep. The mercenaries ruthlessly slaughtered some 130 Chiricahwas, consisting of Chokonans and Nehetnis. Age and sex were irrelevant. Kirker's crew systematically cut down and butchered any Indians in their path. In referring to the incident, Mangas Coloradas said that, quote, "My people were invited to a feast. Aguardiente or whiskey was there. My people drank and became intoxicated and were lying asleep when a party of Mexicans came in and beat out their brains with clubs." End quote. Kirker's party slaughtered everyone they laid their hands on, including one pregnant woman whose child was, quote, "torn alive from the yet palpitating body of its mother, first plunged into the holy water to be baptized, and immediately its brains were dashed against a wall." End quote. After their deed, Kirker's party marched to the city of Chihuahua. Quote, "The scalps carried on poles, in procession, headed by the governor and priests, with bands of music escorting them in triumph to the town." End all quotes. I'm sorry, this is not just for gratuitous violence. But Paul Andrew Hutton writes of the aftermath, quote, "Spybuck supervised the scalping, for his Shawnees had perfected a rapid technique. A neat circle was cut at the crown of the victim's head. The scalper then grabbed hold of the Apache's long hair and pushed off with his feet against the victim's shoulders. A loud pop followed as the scalp came off. The scalps were taken to Spybuck, who treated them with some salt for preservation and attached them to long scalp poles." End quote. Obviously, a party followed the massacre and the parade. A fiesta, if you will. During which time, the priests decorated the front of the church with the Apache scalps. That previously mentioned English explorer, George Ruxton, he was there. And he commented on the affair and said, quote, "Opposite the principal entrance, over the portals which form one side of the square, were dangling the grim scalps of 170 Apaches who had been inhumanely butchered by the Indian hunters in pay of the state." End quote. After the horrific incident, one Mexican soldier was quoted as saying, "All hope for peace is gone." That soldier was more right than he could have known. For the Norteños and for the nation of Mexico, an even larger war was marching from the north in an unstoppable column, and it was going to crush every Mexican rock and thorn that stood in its way towards manifest destiny. If the coming war with America was punishment for how they treated the Apache, how is the United States going to be punished for its treatment later of the Apache? Obviously, for this massacre, revenge by the Apaches was inevitable. Cuchillo Negro, or Black Knife, the chief of the Warm Springs Apaches, called all of the bands who had lost someone, which was dang near every band. But Cuchillo Negro called together all the Apache tribes for a grand council. Mangas Coloradas was definitely in attendance. Mangas' son-in-law Cochise was also there. The plan hatched at the meeting was that the town of Galiana must be destroyed. After the council, a massive fire was built and the chiefs and their warriors danced around it. Goyakla himself, Geronimo, danced around this fire. Goyakla had also grown up in the Mogollon Mountains like Mangas Coloradas, near the headwaters of the Gila River. He was not a chief, but instead he was a warrior and a man with true spiritual power as well. He had the power to heal. He was a medicine man. Paul Andrew Hutton writes of Geronimo, quote, "When he was about 9 or 10, what the Apaches called Night the Stars Fell occurred. This majestic 1832 meteor shower terrified people all across North America. 3 years later, it was followed by the equally awesome appearance of Halley's Comet. Goyakla understood that both of these cosmic events portended great changes to come. He sensed a call to glory and greatness, while others shrank before a dark omen of calamity." End quote. When the warriors that were selected to participate on the siege of Galiana were chosen, they would line up by the giant roaring bonfire, and they would line up across from the drummers, and they danced with their weapons in mock combat. The time for revenge was almost upon the warriors. Meanwhile, Sonora and Chihuahua made the absolutely unprecedented move to join forces. They put their past squabbles behind them, and they decided that eradication of the Apaches was now absolutely necessary. Before the Apaches could plan any reprisals, the Norteños of Mexico were declaring war on the Apaches. After the council, and back at their various camps, the Apaches received news of the Mexicans' planned war of extermination. So they began to prepare more lances, arrows, and bows. They readied their muskets. War was coming. And then, Kit Carson, with 16 men who were heading from California, going all the way to Washington, D.C., well, Kit Carson and his 16 men wandered into the camp of Mangas Coloradas. Carson had news of John C. Fremont's taking of California, and he needed to personally deliver that message to the capital. Which is, it would have been an astounding journey, if he had gotten to complete it. At Mangas Coloradas' camp, Kit Carson, who, if you'll recall, he had met the man previously, although back then he was known as Fuerte. But Kit Carson knew the warrior chief, and in camp they talked. They were friendly, they traded, and Mangas gave the lot of the Americans fresh mounts since theirs had been dang near depleted since leaving California. It was during this meeting, though, that Mangas, or another Chiricahua chief, but possibly Mangas, he gave Kit Carson some astounding news. An American general was in possession of the territory of New Mexico. In May of 1846, 2 months before Kirker's massacre, the United States of America declared war against Mexico. It only took an astounding short 1 month for the Republic to muster troops and militiamen and to begin their march southward. On June 30th, with 1,568 men, soon to be Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny, he set out from Kansas on his long march towards New Mexico. Santa Fe, to be precise. He, his men, and 2 other groups of soldiers made up what would be known as the Army of the West. The 2 other groups consisted of Colonel Sterling Price and his 1,200 men, and there was a unit of 500 men and many of their wives that would become known as the Mormon Battalion. Of course, they'll get their own episode probably in the future Mexican-American series that I'll do one day. On August 14th of that year, 1846, from a rooftop in the beautiful little town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny made this proclamation to the newest residents of the United States. Mr. Alcalde and people of New Mexico, I have come amongst you by the orders of my government to take possession of your country and extend over it the laws of the United States. We come among you for your benefit, not for your injury. Henceforth, I absolve you from all allegiance to the Mexican government. I am your governor. I shall not expect you to take up arms and follow me to fight your own people who may oppose me. But I now tell you that those who remain peaceably at home, attending to their crops and their herds, shall be protected by me and their property, their persons and their religion, and not a pepper nor an onion shall be disturbed or taken by my troops without pay or by the consent of their owner. From the Mexican government you have never received protection. The Apaches and Navajos come down from the mountains and carry off your sheep and even your women, whenever they please. My government will correct all this. It will keep off the Indians, protect you and your persons and property, and I repeat again, will protect you and your religion. End quote. It would take the Americans, the newest wards of the Apache Indians, it would take the U.S. another 50 years to subdue the Apaches. 4 days later, though, Kearny had taken Santa Fe, which meant Mangas Coloradas was right. He had New Mexico. But I do find that speech kind of funny. You know, you're no longer Mexicans whether you want to be or not. I can protect you. I mean, of course we won't, but we'll try. He gave that speech in Las Vegas. I'm not sure where, but if you've ever seen Longmire, Sheriff Longmire's sheriff department is in the square of Las Vegas, New Mexico. Very pretty little town. Shortly after liberating Santa Fe from the Mexicans, Kearny would leave the oldest capital in the U.S. and he would meet with various peoples and tribes around Santa Fe to assuage their fears. It sounds very old-school Spanish-style governorship. At one such meeting, though, on September 23rd, General Kearny met with a Jicarilla Apache chief by the name of Chacon. We haven't talked about the Jicarilla in this episode, but Kearny met with the chief Chacon, and present at this meeting was future Confederate Colonel John T. Hughes, who would write the interaction down. He would actually publish a popular memoir after the war. Hughes wrote this of the interaction between General Kearny and the Jicarilla chief. Quote, "The chief of one branch of the Apaches, with about 30 of his tribe, came to hold a grand council with the governor general. The general made a long speech to him through an interpreter, encouraging them to industry and peaceful pursuits, and particularly to the cultivation of the soil, as the surest and best mode of procuring an honorable subsistence, that they must desist from all robberies and the committing of all crimes against the laws of the territory, that if they did not, he would send his soldiers amongst them and destroy them from the earth. But if they would be peaceable towards their white brethren, he would protect and defend them as he would the New Mexicans, and make them all brothers to the white people and citizens of the same republic and children of the same father, the president at Washington City." To all these things the venerable sachem replied in a spirit worthy of his tribe. He said, quote, "Father, you give good advice for me and my people, but I am now old and unable to work, and my tribe are unaccustomed to cultivating the soil for subsistence. The Apaches are poor. They have no clothes to protect them from the cold, and the game is fast disappearing from their hunting grounds. You must, therefore, if you wish us to be peaceable, speak a good word to the Comanches, the Utes, the Navajos, and the Arapahoes, our enemies, that they will allow us to kill buffalo on the Great Plains. You are rich. You have a great nation to feed and clothe you. I am poor, and have to crawl on my belly like a cat to shoot deer and buffalo for my people. I am not a bad man. I do not rob and steal. I speak the truth. The Great Spirit gave me an honest heart and a straight tongue. I have not two tongues that I should speak forked." He continues, "My skin is red, my head sunburnt, my eyes are dim with age, and I am a poor Indian, a dog. Yet I am not guilty. There is no guilt there," putting his hand on his breast. "No, I can look you in the face like a man. In the morning of my days, my muscles were strong, my arm was stout, my eyes were bright, my mind was clear. But now I am weak, shriveled up with age. Yet my heart is big, my tongue is straight. I will take your counsel because I am weak and you are strong." End all quotes. Obviously, there was just no way the United States could, nor was it willing to, allow the Apache to hunt buffalo on the Great Plains. For soon, the buffalo would be all but extinct in the Buffalo Kingdom anyways. Not to mention, the place the Apaches used to call Apacheria was, at that time, Comancheria. It was also the land of the Northern Plains tribes. No, the Apache would soon find out that they were destined for the reservation system. But that is for the next episode. This is not the last time we will hear of the Jicarilla in this one. 2 days after his meeting with the Jicarilla Apache, Kearny would head for California with 300 men. They were all guided by an old mountain man named Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, and they were following the Rio Grande south, right into Apacheria. Quick note about Broken Hand, though. He was one of the West's most famous, and he was one of the greatest mountain men. He was a trapper and a trader. He was a guide, Indian fighter, and later an Indian agent up north. He was from Ireland, but he took to the West nicely. His nickname, Broken Hand, was on account of a firearms accident that he suffered that left his left hand useless. Always unload your guns before cleaning. I'm not sure if that's what happened to his hand, but that's just a word of warning. On October 6th, Kearny and his men came upon none other than Kit Carson and his 16 men, and that was near Socorro, New Mexico. The two groups exchanged their various pieces of game-changing information, and then Carson told Kearny that Look, don't worry about them Apaches. They are stoked that we are at war with the Mexicans. They hate those guys, and it seems like the Mexicans are about to exterminate the Apaches, so they will definitely fight with us. So no worries with them, or something to that effect. With that news, and the news that California had already been taken by the Americans, Kearny decided to cut his 300 men by 2/3. He kept only 100. He also turned Broken Hand Fitzpatrick around and told him to instead take the news to Washington about California. He then turned back around to Kit Carson and said, "Congratulations, you're now in the Army, and I need you to take me to California." Also, on that same day, October 6, 1846, another famous American military leader and map maker, a Lieutenant William H. Emery, he passed through Apacheria at the same time, and he too ran into some Apaches. And this was possibly the first real meeting of an American Army personnel and the Apaches. Emery was on the Rio Grande, near a place called Valverde, which I could not locate, honestly. But he was at this place when his Indian guides spotted the Apaches. Well, later that evening, the Apaches came down into the Americans' camp. Frank C. Lockwood, and his great storytelling, sums up what happens next, and he quotes from Emery while doing so. Emery, he wrote notes of a military reconnaissance after these incidences of the Mexican-American War. Again, I could have done a better name. They came down to the American camp in a very friendly spirit, and after a council with the officers, now quoting Emery, swore friendship, as usual, no doubt, with the mental reservation to rob the first American or Mexican they should meet unprotected. End quote. The story continues. They supplied the expedition with 4 young warriors as guides. Emery describes them as, quote, smirking and deceitful looking, end quote. Even at this early period, some of them had firearms, end all quotes. At this time, clearly, Emery did not have a high opinion of the Apaches. And then on October 18th, 2 miles from the ghost town of Santa Rita del Cobre, Kearny and his 100 men sat down in camp with the giant warrior legend himself, Mangas Coloradas. Mangas would give Kearny the nickname Horse Chief of the Long Knives, which I think is pretty awesome. Paul Andrew Hutton writes that this is the first time a representative of the United States government, Kearny, and a leader of the Chiricahua Indians, Mangas, had met, although it would not be the last. Except this one was on much better terms than later meetings will be, and Carson had an inkling of that. Hutton says this of the meeting, quote, Mangas pledged good faith and friendship to all Americans, pleased to have an ally in his tribe's war against the common enemy, Mexico. As Kearny presented Mangas with several presents, Carson turned to Kearny's companion, Lieutenant Emery, and winked. Now quoting Carson, quote, I would not trust one of them, end quote. He said of Mangas's pledges with a wry smile, end all quotes. The following day, as they were trading yet again, Lieutenant Emery, not that long after he made the last comments, would comment that these Apache men reminded him of, quote, pictures of antique Grecian warriors, end quote. He was quite impressed with their physique. He was also impressed with their ability to trade. He would make one more comment, though, and this one speaks to their humanity. It really seems he's had a change of opinion. He wrote in his journal, quote, there was amongst them a poor deformed woman, with legs and arms no longer than an infant's. She was well touted, and the gallant manner in which some of the plumed Apaches waited on her, for she was perfectly helpless when dismounted, made it hard for me to believe the tales of blood and vice told of these people. End quote. As Kearny and his Americans left for California, Hutton tells a story of an Apache warrior who approached the group and told them some rather fiery advice in regards to their attitudes towards the Mexicans. This Apache said, quote, you have taken New Mexico and will soon take California. Go then and take Chihuahua, Durango, and Sonora. We will help you. The Mexicans are rascals. We hate and will kill them all. End quote. Right behind Kearny was Lieutenant Colonel Philip Cook and his Mormon battalion. And it's very probable that Mangas Coloradas met with them as well. He would at least later tell an American boundary commissioner that he had indeed met Cook and his Mormons. During this time, while Cook and the Mormon battalion traipsed through Tucson, the Mexicans put up not a single ounce of fight. Why should these norteños care? Their real enemy was the Apache, and they needed to conserve every bullet for that real and true enemy. Jacoby describes the situation at that time like this, quote, "The position of Sonora in the unfolding conflict was marked by deep ambivalence. Outraged that the central government had allowed the presidio system to collapse, the Sonoran government initially declined to contribute to the war effort. In December of 1846, for example, troops at Tucson offered no opposition to the American forces that passed through the presidio on their way to California. Sonorans justified such behavior by explaining that they needed to conserve their limited resources to fight the province's more pressing war with the Apache barbarians." End quote. So the reason the Mormon Battalion, the only religious unit to ever exist in the United States military, the reason the Mormons never fought in a single battle during the Mexican-American War, despite traveling from far eastern Ohio to Nebraska to Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and then to southern New Mexico, southern Arizona, and then over to San Diego, Los Angeles, Monterey, then up to the Sierra Nevadas, where they buried the Donner Party, and then through Nevada and then Salt Lake, which is the longest march in American military history. Despite that enormous march, the Mormons never had a single battle with the Mexicans. And now it makes sense. The Mexicans didn't fire because they feared the Apaches even more. Shortly after that incursion into Mexico by the Mormon Battalion, the vice governor of Sonora, Luis Redondo, issued this decree. "The enemy Apache, joined together with a considerable number of North Americans, have already penetrated to the outskirts of the Presidio of Fronteras." End quote. He then admonishes his people to expel the invaders so that they will, quote, "be recorded in the annals of history." End quote. The Mexicans were right to fear the Apaches. By the fall of 1846, it was time for the Apaches under Cuchillo Negro to exact revenge on Galiena. In between visits from American military leaders, the Chiricahua Apaches, numbering anywhere from, 175 to 200 warriors, they headed down into Mexico and towards their target, Galiena. Among the fighters were Cuchillo Negro, Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, and Goyacla, a.k.a. Geronimo. There are no Mexican sources on this revenge raid. So the only count is an oral account much later by an Apache named Betzinez. He wrote that oral account down, though, and published his very reliable narrative, which I will use in the next episode, I believe. Betzinez says that despite some Apaches falling in the beginning of the battle, the attack was a glorious victory. He would hear stories of it retold throughout his entire life. He said of the incident, quote, "The men who took part in this battle, especially those who were my kinsmen, later told me that everyone agreed that this was the greatest of Apache victories. The whole tribe were tremendously proud of their fighting men, and for years thereafter loved to hear the stories of the battle retold." End quote. A few years later, in 1849, a New Orleans journalist named Thomas Duravage, he visited Galiena and wrote that it was, quote, "once a flourishing spot, but the Indians have been its ruin and impoverished its wealthiest citizens." End quote. In 47 and 48, during the Mexican-American War, the back-and-forth tit-for-tat continued between the Norteños and the Apaches. Some Apaches sued for peace, others continued war. There were atrocities, killings, lots of captives taken by the Apaches so they could trade for their imprisoned people. Mangas, though, is barely mentioned. But horses and mules were stolen, Mexican towns abandoned. Disease, brought accidentally by the Americans, tore through all the Indians of the region, but especially the Apache, and especially because of the measles. The Americans would continue their march south, and they'd blockade Sonora and Chihuahua and Durango, which would further exasperate the Mexicans' plight. The Mexican states could not pay their soldiers, who were constantly threatening to mutiny and constantly did mutiny. They were no longer fighting the Americans after the war, but the Apache threat obviously never dissipated. Elias Gonzalez was yet again put in charge of the defense of Sonora. There were no funds, though. But even as the war with the United States was ending, things only got worse in Sonora and Chihuahua. The Apaches were growing even more bold. And that was mostly because the land that the Chiricahua called home was now in the United States, or most of it. And they could raid Mexico, flee back to the U.S., and then never worry about any Mexican parties pursuing them across the border. They had free reign. But then in late June of 1848, Mangas's very important and brave warrior, son-in-law, Cochise, he was captured by the Mexicans outside of Fronteras. He was then shackled with irons and thrown in the calaboose. A word I love, but the calaboose is just an awful, crude jail. Sweeney writes that this calaboose was actually just a man-made cave about 20 feet long that the Mexicans had dug from the side of the hill underneath the presidio. Cochise remained a prisoner for 6 weeks. This turn of events forced Mangas to leave the safety of New Mexico and the Mogollon Mountains, and it forced him to enter Sonora, where the Apaches had been laying siege to the town. He probably never made it in time to witness the freeing of his son-in-law, but he would stay in Sonora for a year until 1849. The siege on Fronteras was so bad that the citizens began to starve, so the Mexicans naturally sent out a group to find supplies. The Apaches, though, were waiting for this, and half of this Mexican group was killed. The other half was taken prisoner. The Mexicans tried again, with the same results. But eventually, as usual, a peace deal was struck. Prisoners exchanged. Cochise was freed. Fronteras, as a result, was abandoned for some time. 250 years of military might and fortitude, forced to be derelict by the Apaches. Not long afterwards, Tubac, Tumacacori, Cocospera, and Oputo were all also completely abandoned. Some of them for only a time, but they were abandoned. By February of 1848, the war with the United States was over, and the Mexicans lost badly. The Americans now controlled huge swaths of the territory that Mexico once claimed. Polk's presidency was a success for a manifest destiny. The number frequently cited is half of Mexican territory was taken, but most of that quote-unquote territory was completely uninhabited by Spaniards or even Mexicans. The populations were nearly entirely Genizaros or Indians. Besides New Mexico, a few towns in far southern Arizona and southern California, there were no Mexicans living in the territory of the American West that we took as spoils of war. Again, besides the spots I just mentioned. And it seems like California, and some in New Mexico, and some of the ones that even remained in southern Arizona, they had no qualms with the Americans taking over and raising their flags in their towns. Now, of course, that is my bias, but the population of these centers were so low that it's quite the misleading statistic when the reference material kind of angrily states that the U.S. took half of Mexico's land, and almost all the writers I read were American themselves. While it is true, the Americans did pay Mexico $15 million for the territory it took, and later, the Mexicans would try to sell even more land. When the Americans took the territory, though, of course it was not empty, and the peoples living on the land became wards of the United States, including the Apache. And that came with some problems. One of the reasons the Apaches and the Americans had gotten along all right so far was because the Americans were never there to stay. They came, they hunted or trapped or panned for gold, and then they left. But now, this land was theirs, and they were going to settle it. Immediately, that became clear to some of the Apache. The other problem for the Apaches and the Americans was Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It states that the U.S. now has to keep the Apache from invading Mexico, and neither Americans nor Apache could buy stolen goods taken from Mexico. While this may have worried the Apache, as Sweeney puts it, quote, most well-meaning American officials would ignore this requirement, realizing that it was a condition impossible to enforce. End quote. As we know, and as the Mexicans knew at that time, the Apache went wherever they wanted. 300 years of war had not stopped them from raiding or roving, or living in whatever valley they chose, or mountain fortress. And when they came back to America with Mexican stuff, well, the Americans enjoyed purchasing cheaper things that were stolen from Mexico, especially cattle and mules. Instead of the new border helping the Mexicans in the northern section of their nation, that section that bordered the United States, this new border actually hurt the Mexicans way more. Now, the Chiricahua and Western Apaches felt bold and even safe raiding Sonoran towns. I mean, they could just run back into the U.S. without fear of the Mexicans chasing them. In 1849, one such raid into Sonora was so bad that 86 Mexicans lost their lives at the hands of the marauding Apaches. And for that, the Americans would have to pay. Like literally pay. Because the treaty also stated that the Americans would pay for Apache depredations that originated on the U.S. side of the border. That was something even early officials at this time knew would end up costing the United States millions of dollars. Another provision was that the U.S. would force the Apaches to return any Mexican captives they may take during their raids. This one, the Apaches did not understand. I mean, it was only occasionally enforced, but it would truly sour relationships. If they couldn't take captives, how would they get their own captured people back? A year after the war ended, gold was found in California, which, thankfully, was now in the hands of the Americans. When gold was found, the world rushed in. Many Mexicans at this time fled from northern Mexico for California in search of their gold and future, and also to escape Apache raids. Upwards of 5,000 or 6,000 Mexicans actually abandoned the war-ravaged territory for the golden hills of California, leaving the land seemingly defenseless. The Apache took notice, and by the end of 1849, large Apache war parties were roaming the state of Sonora with impunity. One of these roving war parties was 200 strong, and they attacked 150 miles deep into Sonora, almost to the Sonoran capital. They would kill every single Mexican and Mexican allied Indian they came across, men, women, and children. The number reported to the governor was 98 people killed, 22 wounded, and 7 captured. There is little doubt that this party was led by Miguel Narbona, a prominent Chiricahua war chief, and also Mangas Coloradas. There's good evidence that Cochise was there as well. As for the men captured by the Chiricahua Apache, what little life they had left was not going to be pleasant. Towards the end of the 19th century, a Chiricahua Apache summed up what happens to the captured when he described it to an anthropologist named Morris Oppler. Quote, "The Chiricahuas treated Mexicans in a rough way when they were captured. These Chiricahuas were more the enemies of the Mexicans than of any other people on earth, because the Mexicans treated these Chiricahuas in a nasty way. They say they used to tie Mexicans with their hands behind their backs. They then turned the women loose with axes and knives to kill the Mexican prisoner. The man could hardly run, and the women would chase him around until they killed him. Usually the people whose relatives had been killed wanted it to be done. They wanted to have their way about it." End quote. Throughout this time of the late 1840s, early 1850s, I read about more attacks and raids and villages burning on both sides than I can even fathom. Every time it was 20 dead, 5 captured, 8 dead, 4 captured, towns burnt down with the bodies strewn across the fields, just over and over and over again. This was truly a war between the Mexicans and the Chiricahua Apaches. To recall to y'all all of these battles would be tiring, unnecessary, and disheartening. The Mexicans were paying for their treachery with ample amounts of blood. Sure, they'd score a few wins under Elias Gonzalez and his men, but they were rarer than the bloody Apache wins. And the Apache were treacherous as well. Some Apaches eventually were suing for peace. One Apache, quote-unquote, chief, would even promise to kill Mangas Coloradas for the authorities in Chihuahua. But he would die under mysterious circumstances shortly after that declaration. Needless to say, even though I've already said it, there was a lot of death in northern Mexico by the Apaches at this time. All the while, the Americans and the Apaches were both growing leery of each other. By 1849, battles between the Americans and the Apaches were growing in number and intensity. For starters, the Americans had moved into Santa Rita del Cobre, which had been abandoned for over a decade. I mean, it was one of the Chiricahua's greatest achievements. But the Americans were moving into the Mimbres Mountains in search of gold. They were actually moving into every part of Apacheria, the Americans, moving into and moving through on their way to California. American cattle in response were being stolen by the Apaches. The Texan cowboys that were guarding the cattle would be killed. American military leaders were actually even being killed in skirmishes in the mountains. But the Americans were better armed and better trained, and the Apaches could tell the difference. And the Americans had no qualms of crossing the border and pursuing the Apaches into Mexico. As the Americans figured, what were the Norteños even going to do? Not to mention they probably appreciated any killing of any Apache. But just as it appeared that the peace factions of Apaches and the government of Chihuahua were going to sign peace deals in 1849, the state governments of Chihuahua and Durango reinstituted the scalp policy, which they called the Fifths Law. Obviously, this made things worse yet again. This time it was $200 for a scalp and $250 for a live warrior. Kirker and his mercenaries were back on the trail. In 1985, one of the greatest American novels ever written was published. That novel is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West. It is possibly my favorite work of fiction, or at least it's up there. I essentially coerced my wife into reading it shortly after we got married, and I moved in. I said, "Here, read this book." She did. I think it's an exceptionally important novel, and it focuses on this exact time period of the scalp hunters in Chihuahua. The main character, the kid, joins up with Anglo scalp hunters, and some truly horrendous and unbelievable things occur, while the Glanton Gang, it's called, is led by a mysterious, hairless man known as Judge Holden, who may just actually be the devil himself. If you have not read it, I implore you to press pause on this episode, pick it up, and read it cover to cover. And then press play after that. But it is tough at times to read, but it is very good. But John Joel Glanton of the Glanton Gang, he was a real person. He hunted for scalps in Chihuahua in 1849, especially after the Apaches massacred a group of American, German, and French gold seekers who were headed to California. Clearly, some of the problems with bringing back scalps are addressed in the book, like, long black hair is long black hair, no matter if it came from a Yaqui, an Apache, or for the Anglos, a Mexican. It's an ill-advised practice, and it inflamed relations to an even worse level than they already were at that time. spiraled upwards, I believe Jacoby put it earlier. The contracts of blood, as the Apaches called them, the scalp laws, they were rescinded before the year was even over. One of the very first Anglo cattle ranchers in the American Southwest was none other than Mr. Kit Carson. And in 1849, he and a friend had started over after the Mexican-American War. And they had started a ranch that he called Rayado. And it was situated in the Rayado Valley of northern New Mexico in the town of Rayado. The town was the first town that had been founded after the Mexican-American War on the Great Plains side of New Mexico. The town and Carson's ranch were just off the Santa Fe Trail, and they were just south of the town of Cimarron. The town sits right at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which are the most southern Rocky Mountains, the mountains I live just south of. Today, you can visit Kit Carson Mesa in Rayado and the Kit Carson Museum. The whole area is quite some distance north from the southern New Mexican Chiricahua Apache that I've been discussing at length. So this is just a little reprieve from the southern deserts of the Chiricahua and Norteños. So in 1849, Kit Carson is on the far southern end of the Rocky Mountains on the eastern Great Plains side of them. This was very much Comancheria. But it was also Apacheria, still a little. This land, before the Comanche, this area was claimed by the buffalo hunting, migratory, dog sled using Apaches that would eventually be known as the Jicarilla. But by 1849, they were just a shadow of their former self. Hampton Sides in Blood and Thunder writes this of the Jicarilla, quote, "The Jicarillas had few allies. They were overpowered by larger, better armed, and more cohesive warrior tribes of the plains, especially the Comanches, who made frequent incursions into their territory. The Jicarillas were a cornered people, living in the interstices in the shadow of stronger nations. Years later, a spokesman of the Jicarillas would remember this dark time when everyone in the tribe seemed plunged in fear. Quote, at the first sound, even a shout, they all made for the brush, he recalled. And whenever they went out on the plains, they were afraid to stay there. End quote. Now Sides continues, since the American occupation of New Mexico, the Jicarilla hunting grounds had consistently thinned as new settlers moved into their already attenuated territory. Squeezed in this way, the Jicarillas turned to raiding. End all quotes. Actually, I'll just continue to quote Sides because he sums up this Jicarilla history at this time quite well, and he uses great quotes in doing so. For several years, the outrages committed by the Jicarillas have been hotly discussed throughout this part of the territory. An army lieutenant stationed in Taos reported in the summer of 1849 that the Jicarillas were, quote, robbing everywhere throughout the mountains, end quote. Colonel George A. McGill at the time described the Jicarillas as, quote-unquote, troublesome and, quote-unquote, incorrigible, and darkly predicted that they would, quote, continue to rob and murder our citizens until they are exterminated, end quote. When he was governor, Charles Bent characterized the Jicarilla Apaches as, quote-unquote, a great annoyance to life in New Mexico. They were an indolent and cowardly people, he wrote, living principally by thefts committed on the Mexicans, there being but little game in the country through which they range, and the fear of other Indians not permitting them to venture on the plains for buffalo. End all quotes. With anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people within the Jicarilla band at this time, that extermination would not have been difficult, it's sad to say. But the Jicarilla Apache people, they were desperate and hungry. As discussed, their game in the mountains and on the plains were thinning out. And they often weren't even welcome in the mountains or on the plains. They needed to hunt on anyways. They were not adept at farming. They, like their southern cousins, depended on raiding to stay alive. Sides remarks, quote, In the 3 years since the American occupation, the Jicarillas had swiped many thousands of sheep from ranchers in northeastern New Mexico. End quote. Kit Carson and his friend Maxwell, whom he had started the ranch with, they knew all this, and they expected it. They appreciated the situation. They had many and often run-ins with the Apache in what Kit Carson and other residents of the area called dinner stops. These stops were requests backed by a plethora of warriors for food, tobacco, and other gifts that the Anglo landowner could not refuse to give or should not refuse if they valued their life. But not everyone knew this lesson of giving gifts when the Apaches demanded them. Some travelers even considered the Apache bribes as highway robbery. Some travelers would refuse to hand over what was asked for. Those travelers would learn a hard lesson. One such traveling party in October of 1849 became known as the White Party. The White Party was headed by James White. Along with him was his wife Anne, their daughter, and their servant. Also a German named Lauberger, another unnamed American, and his Mexican servant. When the Apaches appeared the first time in few numbers, White shooed them away while refusing to pay. Shortly afterwards, though, the same Apaches reappeared, but with many more of them. Again, with rifles and knives, James White refused to pay. I will once again quote Hampton Sides in his book about Kit Carson to sum up the tragedy that is about to ensue. They, meaning the Apache, they descended in a storm of arrows, promptly killing White's Mexican escort, who fell into the burning campfire. The travelers attempted to flee but did not get far. Soon, the bodies of White and his 2 other guides bristled with shafts. The Indians scooped up Ann White, her daughter, and the servant, and stole across the prairie. End quote. But not all of the Apaches fled. Some of them hid nearby the ransacked carriages and the dead bodies, and they waited for more travelers to come so that they could also raid them once they discovered this horrible scene. And that is exactly what happened. Except this Mexican caravan somehow escaped. Well, all but one. A young boy had been shot with an arrow, and he had played dead. And I guess his Mexican escorts just left him there. After everyone was gone, including the Apache, this Mexican boy got up and walked until he was rescued, and then he was taken to Santa Fe, where he told the authorities what had happened. Before long, a $1,000 reward for retrieving Ann White was declared. A week later, some Puebloans told the authorities that they had been in the camp of some Jicarillas when they noticed a white woman and her baby. They were both in distress. Immediately after the news spread, a company of 1st Dragoons under Major William Greer was dispatched to track down the woman. But their first stop was on the other side of the mountains, at the home of one Kit Carson. Carson was not too hard persuaded to join, and immediately off he went with Major Greer and the Dragoons towards the site of the massacre, which was only about 40 miles east of Rayado. Dragoons just means cavalry. Before the Civil War, that's what the U.S. Army called them. That was the popular term for cavalry in Europe. At the site of the massacre, everything but the bodies, which had been buried earlier, was as it had been. Everything was broken into, and everything the Apaches could not carry was destroyed. It was now early November, and there was a little bit of snow on the ground, and even Carson, possibly the greatest Anglo tracker to have ever lived, even Carson found it near impossible to read the signs that were presented to him. He said of this, quote, "It was the most difficult trail that I ever followed." End quote. But Carson being Carson, he teased out what information he could, and eventually, after almost giving up many times, they found a Jicarilla camp. And in it, well, it was the remnants of a Jicarilla camp. And in it was a woman's garment. And then days later, he found another camp, and in it, another piece of woman's clothing. Was Ann White leaving a trail? Carson certainly thought so. He would say of finding these garments, quote, "It was the cause of renewed energy," end quote. 12 days after they'd started the chase, though, Carson and Greer came upon a camp of Jicarilla Apaches, not an abandoned one. The camp was several hundred strong, and it was led by a chief known as White Wolf. This camp was on the banks of the Canadian River near modern-day Tucumcari, which is just at the edge of the Llano Estacado. If the Apache fled onto the Staked Plains, finding them would become extremely difficult, if not impossible. In Carson's mind, when they found this camp, the only option was to attack immediately. No delaying, no letting the Apaches gather up their stuff and flee or fight back. So that's what he did. He charged. He led the entire dragoons and Greer straight for the Jicarilla camp with his galloping horse. Except Greer had countermanded the order, and he told everyone to halt and let's talk things over. He wanted to meet with White Wolf, not charge into possible defeat or death. Obviously, Carson was not going in alone as his horse galloped towards the camp, so he wheeled his mount around and unhappily met with Greer. Hampton Sides writes of what happened next. He, meaning Carson, he strongly disagreed with Greer's decision to delay. If Ann White was alive and hidden somewhere in the encampment, the Jicarillas would not turn her over without a fight. Greer's best chance of success, Carson felt, was to surprise the Jicarillas in a lightning assault that gave them no time to react. But now precious minutes were dripping away. End quote. Carson, of course, was right. And as soon as the Jicarillas spotted the White Eyes, they began packing up in haste. The element of surprise had been lost. But even still, Greer waited. On what? I'm not sure. On his cowardice to flee him? But in the ticking minutes that were wasting, a ticked-off dead-shot aim Apache picked up a rifle and shot at Greer, and the bullet tore through Greer's clothing, slammed into his chest without entering his flesh, and knocked him off his horse. Once he'd caught his breath, he ordered the charge. But it was way too late. By the time they reached the camp, the Jicarillas had spread out in all directions. All of them except one poor soul who was swimming. It's not funny, he was shot and killed. Another fleeing Apache was also shot. Not sure if he was killed. The news would get worse. Sides writes of the aftermath, quote, But then Carson spotted something. About 200 yards from the campsite, a figure was sprawled on the hard-baked plain. The men rode over to inspect and found to their dismay that it was the corpse of an American woman. Ann White had been shot through the heart with a single arrow. She was perfectly warm, Carson said, and had not been killed more than 5 minutes. By the looks of things, she must have known that her rescuers were at hand. She had been running away from the Jicarillas. Carson wrote, quote, It was apparent that she was endeavoring to make her escape when she received the fatal shot. End all quotes. Ann White's body told a sad story of captivity, beatings, and worse. She was covered in bruises and scratches. Carson wrote that she, quote, was a frail, delicate, and very beautiful woman. But having undergone such usage as she suffered, nothing but a wreck remained. It was literally covered with blows and scratches. Her countenance, even after death, indicated a hopeless creature. End quote. Carson goes on to say of her, quote, She is surely far more happy in heaven with her God than among friends of this earth. End quote. In a sad twist of irony, though, found near her body, among the abandoned Jicarilla camp, was a pulp fiction novel that had recently been published by a man named Charles Averill, titled Kit Carson, The Prince of the Gold Hunters. In it, Carson is ever the Western hero that Easterners read about by candlelight. Even in 1849, moments after obtaining 60% of its territory, the myth of the West was strong in the minds of Americans. This was the first time the real Kit Carson ran right smack into the myth Kit Carson. He'd later write, quote, "The book was the first of its kind I had ever seen, in which I was made a great hero, slaying Indians by the hundred." End quote. In that novel, though, Kit Carson heroically rides into the Indian camp and actually saves the kidnapped girl from Boston. The fictional damsel in distress lived. The real-life damsel in distress was abused and slaughtered. Carson would later say, quote, "Knowing that I lived near, I have often thought that as Miss White read the book, she prayed for my appearance, and that she would be saved." End quote. It is a heartbreaking story, and one that is tough to relay. But of course, as we have gone through, this was life for the last 300 years for the Apache and the Mexicans, and soon to be the Americans. Constant death, constant revenge, and constant sadness. Carson blamed Greer for her death and not being able to save her in time, and her death would haunt Carson for the rest of his life. A decade later, despite Carson never learning how to read, when a friend offered him his own copy of this novel, Carson threatened to, quote, "burn the damn thing." End quote. Neither Ann White's young daughter nor their servant were ever found. Lobo Blanco, or White Wolf, the Jicarilla Apache chief, he would be killed by a regiment of dragoons in 1854 by being crushed to death with a boulder. Back down south in sunny, cheery Sonora, 1850 saw much the same as the previous years. Raids, counter-raids, murders, fires, death, captures, etc., etc. Elias Gonzalez was fired after nearly 20 years of service in Sonora, and a haughty man named Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco took over. But there was a brief time when he hadn't arrived yet, and Elias had left, which meant Sonora was even more defenseless. Jacoby writes in Shadows at Dawn of this violent year of 1850, quote, "The following year," reported the Sonoran writer Jose Valesco, quote, "more than ever the ferocity of these savages spread over the unfortunate Sonora." End quote. The Apaches burned haciendas, ran off livestock, attacked caravans bound for California, and carried women and children into captivity. When Mexican troops under Colonel Carrasco undertook a retaliatory raid, the Apache simply withdrew to their other side of the dividing line. End all quotes. Valesco would later write about how the entire northern section of Sonora was eventually abandoned due to the Apache raids, as people fled the countryside for larger towns. He wrote, quote, "What better testament to Apache raids than these deserted fields, sprinkled with blood? What better witnesses than these abandoned haciendas, ranches, and towns?" End quote. Even sheep herding by the Mexicans would eventually cease due to the ferocious and random nature of the Apache raids. Jacoby writes how the people of these cities that attracted the countryside folks, these people would build huge walls or dig deep ditches to try to keep away the Apaches. He even states some of these desperate people would keep their animals in their own home at night. But in the end, all these fortifications, they only served to make it even more enticing and exciting for the Apaches, who still succeeded in stealing from places like Tucson. It did not help that some of these Apache warriors were kidnapped and Apachified Mexicans. That fact horrified the people of Sonora, who felt like they were sometimes being attacked by their own kin and neighbors. In one pitched battle in early 1851 at a place infamously called Pozo Hediondo, Mangas Coloradas, Geronimo, Cochise, Ho, and many other warriors killed every single Mexican officer on the field. Much of that battle was hand-to-hand combat. War to the knife, just as Mangas had predicted. The Mexicans sent reinforcements, But once they'd reached the battlefield and saw the many, many mangled dead Mexicans, they refused to pursue the Apaches, which, well, because of that, the Apaches went on to the Presidio of Pacoachi. They killed its mayor, a few other residents, and then traded captives before heading back to their various mountain strongholds. I mentioned a name there, Ho. Well, that's Dakluji's father, Dakluji of Ivbal's Inde. I've quoted from him a few times and will continue to quote from him. Ho was a warrior chief himself, and an important one. Carrasco's stated Apache policy was, quote, war to the death, except females of all ages, and males under the age of 15, end quote. He himself would not abide by the males-only policy, I'll tell you that. The Mexican forces were also now forbidden to negotiate with the Apaches any longer. No more battles for a while, and then some captures, and then white flags raised, and prisoners exchanged, and then each party went their separate ways. It was now extermination of the Apache warrior class. In March of 1851, in response to the Pozo Hediondo defeat, Carrasco would begin his policy of extermination at Janos, in Chihuahua. Carrasco was leader of Sonora. During one of the many trading parties after a raid, where the Chiricahuas would trade their stolen Sonoran loot with the Chihuahuans, Carrasco secretly surrounded the town as the Apaches got hammered on mezcal and whiskey. Predictably, once everyone had fallen asleep, Carrasco attacked and killed as many Apache men, women, and children as he could. Paul Andrew Hutton writes this of the incident, quote, a young warrior named Goyakla, one who yawns, found his aged mother alongside his wife and 3 children, all scalped in pools of blood. Whenever I saw anything to remind me of former happy days, he declared years later, my heart would ache for revenge on Mexico. He had a vision while weeping over his loss, and from it came his mystical warrior power. Goyakla, said a voice 4 times, the Apache magical number. No gun can ever kill you. I will take the bullets from the guns of Mexicans, and I will guide your arrows. He might be wounded, but he could never be killed. From that day onward, vengeance became his driving passion. In time, he exacted ghastly blood atonement from the Mexicans. His terrified enemies called out to Saint Jerome for deliverance, thus gave to him a new name, Geronimo. End quote. In Ivbal's Inde, Dakluji talks quite a bit about Geronimo. In one quote on his power of never dying, Dakluji says, quote, I think that Usin's promise is what gave Geronimo his wonderful courage. He was by nature already a brave person, but if one knows that he will never be killed, why be afraid? I don't know that Geronimo ever told his warriors that he had supernatural protection, but they were with him in many dangerous times and saw his miraculous escapes, his cures for wounds, and the results of his medicine. So his warriors knew that Geronimo was alive only because of Usin's protection. End quote. That protection from the Creator, Usin, gave Geronimo a greater ability to exact revenge on his hated enemies. Dakluji later tells Ivbal that Geronimo's enemies, as with all Chiricahua at this time, were the Mexicans. And because of this incident at Janos by Carrasco, Geronimo would forever exact his revenge. He says, quote, in years to come, Geronimo took ample revenge upon the Mexicans, and as long as he lived, he hated them. I sat beside his bed in the hospital at Fort Sill the night Geronimo died, and I know. End quote. We will talk more about Geronimo in the next episode. By early 1852, many Chiricahua bands were themselves at war with the Americans, although not all, and not all the time. At least not like they were in Mexico. But the trouble had started. Some of the trouble was on account of the Americans' efficiency in weaponry. Around this time, the Americans began using howitzers to devastating and frightening effect on the Apaches. In January of 52, the Apaches attacked an American outpost after the army had murdered some Apaches, which happened because the Apaches had attacked some Americans, etc. 2 sergeants died in the fighting, and a few other soldiers as well. One soldier, a red-headed soldier, was scalped. Another was badly mutilated. Sweeney mentions very briefly, and I hadn't seen it anywhere else, so it may be one of those sweeping under the rug situations, but Sweeney mentions briefly that the red-headed soldier was scalped because the Apache believed the red hair had power. Although, according to dang near everyone, the Apaches didn't scalp, right? DeClugy even told Eve Ball that Geronimo didn't scalp until after his family had been murdered and scalped, but that the greater Chiricahua Apache didn't scalp until after Mangas Coloradas' death. So I'm not sure what to believe about the scalping and mutilation that the Apaches apparently did according to the American, Mexican, Spanish, and O'odham sources, but which according to the Apache sources, they never did. Except for the times that they did. One soldier at the funeral of those slain in the battle that I just talked about wrote this, quote, "The triple funeral was a sad ceremony. No funeral is a pleasant one, but a funeral at a lonely frontier military fort after a skirmish in which the comrades who are buried have been killed and one tortured by savages is a sorrowful affair." End quote. On July 11th, 1852, a momentous event occurred when Mangas Coloradas signed a treaty with the Americans at the ancient pueblo of Acoma. It would be the only treaty Mangas would ever sign with the Americans in his entire lifetime. But because he and his people were so remote down in the Mogollon and Burro Mountains, according to Sweeney, his life changed very little after the agreement. An agreement which he kept, except for the part about not raiding Sonora, obviously. The reason why he even made the treaty in the first place is because Mangas simply could not keep up a two-front war. As the skirmishes with the Americans were increasing in frequency and violence, the war with Mexico was becoming more and more difficult. He couldn't have 2 sets of invaders declaring extermination on his people at the same time. The meeting at Acoma was a strange turn of events, but Mangas was at this time on good terms with the Puebloans and the Navajo. And he still respected the Americans, and he believed that they would keep their end of the bargain. So Mangas ascended the ancient steps to Acoma, met with the Americans at his own possible demise, and hatched out a peace plan. Trusting the Americans, though, would ultimately be Mangas Coloradas' demise. But for now, it was all well and good. He was there to meet the commander of the 9th Military Department, aka New Mexico. That man was Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Vose Sumner. He was a Bostonian and he was a stickler for the rules. He traveled with Kearny to New Mexico back during the war, but now he was the military officer in charge of the territory. He was a tough man to get along with, but he was a good soldier. During the war with Mexico, a musket ball had struck and glanced off his thick skull. It earned him the nickname Bull. The only Apache that could match Sumner in arrogance and boldness was Mangas Coloradas. Wearing the uniform of a Mexican artillery officer whom he had recently slain, Mangas strolled into Sumner's camp on the ancient Puebloan Mesa and decided to make a deal. Sweeney sums up the whole affair nicely. Mangas Coloradas often showed his willingness to parley with Americans, for he usually trusted them, being one of the few Chiricahua leaders who did, even if it meant endangering his own safety. It must have been quite a meeting between the venerable and powerful Chiricahua Apache chief and the Martinet from New England. Accompanied by a few of his people, the chief audaciously entered Colonel Sumner's tent, quote, made himself very much at home, end quote, and in a matter-of-fact manner acceded to Sumner, "You are chief of the white man. I am chief of the red man. Now let us have a talk and treat." Although he was now in his early 60s, Mangas very much impressed John Greiner, who described Mangas as, quote, a magnificent-looking Indian, He is undoubtedly the master spirit of his tribe." End quote. Mangas, who boasted that his will and word are law to my people, admitted that his people had grown weary of war and now desired peace with Americans. The Mexicans, however, were another story. End quote. The treaty basically said that the Chiricahua Apache would honor the United States and their new jurisdiction. They'd allow military outposts to be built on their land, and that they would have friendly relations with the Americans. For a time, that friendly relations with the Americans would hold. It was a good plan. The only hiccups in the region at this time were the illicit trading the Army did with the Apaches, and the fact that the Apache couldn't help themselves when it came to taking Mexican prisoners. It also didn't help that the appointed Indian agents were sometimes also in on the illicit trading. Often the Army and the Indian agents had no problem trading whiskey for stolen Mexican livestock, mules, or horses. The problem with this arrangement is self-evident. Mangas Coloradas, though, he still didn't mind the Americans, and he got along fine with them for the most part, especially as they abandoned many of the forts they set up before finding out that they weren't necessary at this time. Like Santa Rita del Cobre. They left it, but only temporarily. The new Indian agent in late 1852 was from the beautiful state of Georgia, and he was somewhat competent. He realized the Apache must quote-unquote steal or starve. He also wanted to teach the Apache to raise livestock and to farm. But for now, the U.S. needed to pass out rations to keep the peace. The new governor of New Mexico liked this plan, and so did the Chiricahuas, who in that winter of 1852 to 1853, they were near starvation levels. The governor, also in April of 53, after nearly causing a second war with Mexico by threatening to inhabit the lands not yet purchased by the U.S., but in 53 he signed a sweeping peace treaty with the Apache of southern New Mexico that asked them to choose a head chief to settle down, to become ranchers, to start farming, to stop raiding. It prohibited the quote-unquote ancient custom of retaliation, and in return the government would give them food for 3 years. Mangas Coloradas did not sign this agreement. Apache historian Dan L. Thrapp wrote of the treaty, quote, "One might as well covenant with the wind to still, or the tide to cease. These provisions went against the whole fabric of Apache custom and social organization." End quote. It didn't matter. The bureaucracy of the federal government nixed the peace plan almost immediately when the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a man named George Mannypenny, he took office. Although he'd later admit that, he had made that decision in haste before realizing the governor's rather good plan. In reality, over the years, Mannypenny really did have the Indians' best interests at heart, and he would attempt to work and make their lives better, mostly by convincing the Apache to settle down and farm. Good luck with that. It's instances like this, and the fact that many bureaucrats had no idea of Apache culture, it's things like that that ultimately derail the peace between the Apache and the United States. Meanwhile, the Apache, led by Mangas and other warring chiefs, continued to raid and kill in Mexico, specifically Sonora. And in April of 1853, the Apaches under Mangas would kidnap the courageous and youthful nephew of Mangas's old rival, Elias Gonzalez. The young man's name was Abundio Elias. Too many Eliases. This would cause quite the stir in Sonora, since the young man was practically of Sonoran aristocracy. The state would dispatch over 130 troops to chase down the 300-strong group of Apache, but they were too late. On their way back to the U.S., the Apache would raid their seemingly favorite target of Fronteras, which had now been reoccupied by the Mexicans. A heavy battle ensued there, and many people died. The Sonoran and federal troops sent to intercept the Apache would never make it to Mangas, and it's most likely that after they discovered who Abundio Elias was, they killed him. It was his uncle, after all, who had slaughtered over 100 Apaches quite recently. With regards to this eternal blood feud between these two groups, a future capable Indian agent of the Apaches named Michael Stick would realize that there was little he could do about it. Edwin Sweeney read one of Stick's letters to the governor in 1853 and summed up his insight. Quote, "In coming years, the honest and objective Stick would come to realize that this brutal and stark picture of relations between the Mexicans and Chiricahua Apaches went both ways. Neither group had a monopoly on savage and barbaric behavior towards the other. Neither party could recall who began the bloody warfare. Violence begot more violence, and the never-ending cycle seemed destined to continue with no end in sight." End quote. Back in New Mexico, the governor learned that, much to everyone's surprise, the Apache were planting and tilling the land. They were growing corn. But they weren't eating it. Oh, no. They were, quoting the Indian agent from Georgia, quote, "Yesterday I found many of the Indians drunk from a miserable beer they make from corn." End quote. The governor would not learn that, though, and the Indian agent Wingfield from Georgia would report that, quote, "Our farming experiment succeeds admirably." End quote. That miserable beer was no doubt Tiswin. The Apaches loved Tiswin, although it could get them into trouble. See my series for subscribers over the Apache Kid about that. The Apaches really were planting, though, not just corn. They had 50 acres of melons, pumpkins, no doubt beans and squash, and corn. Truthfully, to get any Apache to plant was a small miracle. Maybe this plan that was already nixed by the feds, without anyone in New Mexico knowing that, maybe the plan could have worked. In May, Mangas would meet this Indian agent, Agent Wingfield, and the native Georgian would be floored by the towering Apache man. He would write to the governor admiringly, and he'd say, quote, "Mangas Coloradas came in today. I assure you that he is a noble specimen of the genus Homo. He comes up nearer to the poetic ideal of a chieftain, such as Homer in his Iliad would describe, than any person that I have ever seen. No feudal lord in the paltry days of chivalry ever had his vassals under better subjection. His manners are stern, dignified, and reserved. Seldom speaks, but when he does, it is to the point and with great good sense. You may be assured that he is the master spirit among the Apaches. The Indians ought to hold a junta or council tonight and let us know the result on tomorrow." End quote. You'd think, being a Georgian myself, I'd be able to do a better Georgia accent, antebellum Georgia accent. That was terrible. After a follow-up meeting the next day, Mangas agreed to point out a great spot for the army to make a camp. And Mangas talked with both the Indian agent Wingfield and the army representative, Captain Steen. And Captain Steen had this to say of the Apache chief, quote, "Mangas has more sense than all the rest of them put together." End quote. Steen wasn't a big lover of the Indians. After meeting Mangas a few years prior, back at Santa Rita del Cobre, Steen had actually remarked it was remarked that he had said he hoped the Sonorans, quote, "would catch Mangas and give him a good drubbing," end quote. Maybe he changed his mind about the giant Apache warrior since then. By the end of 1853, Wingfield had been replaced by the even more capable agent Michael Stick. He was apparently sincere, honest, and competent, maybe even beyond competent. In his notes at the end of his over 500-page biography of Mangas Coloradas that I read from cover to cover, Sweeney writes this of Stick. "He was arguably the best agent ever assigned to the Chiricahuas. He combined honesty with diplomacy to gain the trust and respect of the Chihinis and Bedonkahis. He also provided some of the early ethnological data that we have on the Apaches. Besides that, with Mangas Coloradas, he developed a good relationship with Cochise before leaving the post in early 1861. End quote. Stick would be reassigned as Indian agent to various peoples by 3 different presidents. His honesty knew no bounds, and the Apaches trusted him. In October of 1854, Mangas Coloradas would finally meet Stick. Switching tracks here a little bit. After gold was discovered in California in 49, and then the territory became a state in 1850, one man formed grand designs to link that far-off land with Dixie. Then Secretary of War and future President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, he wanted a railroad through the territories of New Mexico and Arizona. While many Americans at the time didn't think the dreary, bare, sandy, parched, and sterile Arizona was worth purchasing, Jeff Davis, he knew the impact that this would have on the nation, and he knew a railroad linking a Pacific port and the South could lead to a lifeline of riches. Unfortunately, the land south of the Gila River in Arizona was not part of the United States yet, despite us besting Mexico and securing most of the Southwest in that Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But Mexico's government, ran by Santa Anna, yes, the same man who attacked the Alamo, well, his government was corrupt and they were broke. And defending the 300 Mexicans in Tucson from the constant Apache attacks was proving difficult, to say the least. So President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sold all of that land to the Americans for $10 million. Although the original idea was to have a port on the Gulf of California, which I imagine would have been Puerto Peñasco. Congress, and we'll never understand why, but Congress did not want that much land, so it cut the deal by 9,000 square miles and raised the boundary to its present-day line. With the strike of a pen in June of 1854, the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, added 30,000 square miles of new territory. Territory we know and love here as the American Southwest. But this is territory the criminal General Sherman despised. He infamously said, quote, "We had one war with Mexico to take Arizona, and we should have another to make her take it back." End quote. Shortly after the purchase, Secretary Jefferson Davis promised troops to be stationed in Tucson to defend the new Americans from their enemy, the Apaches. And 2 years later, he'd follow through by sending 4 companies of dragoons to the region. Each company had around 65 military personnel, from officers to privates to support staff. Carl Jacobi, in Shadows at Dawn, presents the image of Americans arriving to Tucson 2 years later after the region was purchased. He writes, quote, "Having brought an American flag with them, the dragoons' first act was to hoist it over Tucson's adobe walls on a crude flagstaff of spliced-together mesquite poles. Such rituals, the new arrivals hoped, sent a tangible message that Tucson and its environs were now forever parts of the United States." End quote. But this new part of the United States proved to be somewhat difficult to keep tame. The whole region, at first, was placed under the command of Santa Fe. It was put into the New Mexican territory, even down Arizona. But that just did not work. Santa Fe was too far away. One visitor to Tucson at the time called the whole area, a paradise of devils. That whole question of creating a separate territory won't be resolved until the time frame of the next episode, though. For now, future Arizona was part of New Mexico, and the line between the U.S. and Mexico was redrawn yet again. The Apaches weren't really sure of what to make of all of this. In the end, Sherman was proven wrong when silver, gold, and tons of other precious metals were found in the various hills and streams that the United States had just purchased. If only we had purchased all that Santa Anna had been willing to sell. Much like the land that America gained after the Mexican-American War, this land was mostly inhabited by Indians, Apaches mainly, somewhat Odam. So at first, the Norteños did not care about the boundary moving, but eventually they came to despise the new line in the desert sand when it became clear that yet again, the Americans were not willing to enforce the part of their various treaties that stated the Americans would stop the Apache from raiding Sonora and Chihuahua. Oh, and the Americans would stop buying things that had been taken from the Norteños. Those complaints won't end until the raiding of Mexico finally, after over 300 years. Those complaints to Washington won't end until the Apache slow their raidings in the 1860 when they focused their wars on America. As we know, the Apache were not the only native residents of the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest. I mentioned in the last episode that the O'odham were also present in sufficient enough numbers to be of use to the various European conquerors. And the O'odham, because of their close ties to the Spaniards, Mexicans, and then the Americans, they were enemies of the Apache. During this time period of the mid-19th century, the O'odham records tell of devastating ambushes and raids by the Apache throughout the whole time period. But they also tell of a few successes against the Apache. The Apache the O'odham would have been in contact with would not have been the Chiricahua bands of Mangas Coloradas, Cuchillo Negro, Cochise, Geronimo, and Ho. These Apaches that they came into contact with were most likely the Western Apaches. One such violent encounter in 1839 had 2 O'odham killed before they enacted revenge. For this revenge, the O'odham shot and wounded an Apache man named Slenderleg, whom they captured and brought back to their village. Slenderleg probably had some sort of deformity which left him with, a skinny leg. So the O'odham shot him, captured him, brought him to their camp, and then they danced around him for quite a few hours while 2 widowed by the Apache women, O'odham women, they paced the outer circle. After the dances, the dancers opened a corridor for the 2 women who came with mesquite clubs and beat Slenderleg the Apache to death. This actually mirrors that report from the Chiricahua Apache I mentioned earlier about torturing the captured Mexicans. Another recorded story by the Pima or O'odham of southern Arizona, another story tells about an incident in 1846 or 47 when Apaches came by moonlight to steal horses, but they were chased down to the river where all the Apaches were killed. A ton more instances of interactions between the O'odham and the Apaches were recorded during the 1800s on something the O'odham called calendar sticks. This is a bit of a departure in our story from the Apache, but these sticks recorded awesome stories, so they're worth a mention. These calendar sticks were skeletons of saguaros with a form of writing on them that told tales of the individuals in each O'odham village. It was, to me, extremely interesting to read about them, as I had never heard of these before. Their existence immediately made me wonder if their ancestors, the O'odham ancestors, also had something similar. Jacoby and other anthropologists must have also speculated on that, because Jacoby wrote, quote, "Whether the keeping of such sticks first arose as a response to European forms of writing or represents a long-standing O'odham custom is uncertain. The oldest sticks now known only document events going back to the early 1800s. What this absence tells us about the origins of the calendar stick, however, is unclear. In the 20th century, the people typically destroyed the sticks upon their caretaker's death. Presumably, this practice held in earlier times as well." End quote. Obviously, that is extremely intriguing. I really would like to know if there was a form of writing before the 1800s. We'll probably never know. I'll just quickly read 2 more stories on these O'odham calendar sticks that relate to the Apaches and this time period. 1853 to 54. The Apaches came to steal horses and brought a live vulture with them. They were discovered and several killed. 1855 to 56. The village of Skaakok was approached one evening by 7 Apaches who were discovered and surrounded. 6 escaped in the darkness, but one was tracked into the arrow bushes where he dropped his bow. He was soon found to have secreted himself in a hole washed deep in the sand. The Pimas could not see or reach him, so they shook live coals down upon the fugitive, which caused him to yell and suddenly leap out among them. The apparition so startled everyone that no move was made to detain him. As he was passing through their line, some asked those around them, "Can we catch him?" But he was such a giant, and the peculiar manner of his appearance among them so unnerved for a moment the courage of the men whose deepest instinct was to crush out the life of the Apache, that he made his escape. End all quotes. I love the imagery of the Apaches coming to steal the horses, probably at night, and they came with a live vulture. Was it a pet? That's very cool. Well, except that a bunch of Apaches died. And the imagery also of a giant Apache, maybe like of Mangas' size, running through a crowd of huddled O'odom with sparks and embers dancing off him as he screeched through the night. That's great. Good for him. By the mid-1850s, Mangas Coloradas was in his mid-60s. Things were beginning to change for the Chiricahua Apaches. Their numbers were actually decreasing in 1855. They were beginning to settle down and farm more, though. Actually, a lot of Apache bands were beginning to farm more. Or attempting to. While the Apaches still raided into Mexico, those raids decreased and lessened in severity. The Chiricahua also signed many treaties with both the Mexicans and the Americans. None of them would stick, but their willingness was surprising. The tide of Americans just seemed endless and ever encroaching, though. And it was causing problems for Apaches to the east and to the west of the Chiricahua. In June of 1854, the Mescalero Apaches would attack wagon trains from their stronghold in the Big Bend country of Texas. That group was led by a man named Chief Gomez. After a year of attempting to plant crops and live peacefully, the Mescalero were getting overrun with the White Eyes. They were invading their land with humans and whiskey. John Upton Terrell writes of this, quote, "The flood of whiskey destroyed the Mescaleros' initiative. They bartered their horses, saddles, harness, implements, and even their personal belongings for drink. Feuds developed. Fights in which Indians were killed frequently occurred. They were sliding down the path to hell." End quote. The governor at that time, Governor Merriweather, was incorrectly under the assumption that the peaceful Sierra Blanca Mescalero had attacked the wagons that Chief Gomez had. So, Merriweather sent the commander of New Mexico, General John Garland, after them. The Sierra Blanca Mescalero are today near Ruidoso in the Sacramento Mountains, a place I fell in love with over a decade ago, and a place that my wife loved so much it convinced her to find us our own mountain stronghold here in New Mexico. General Garland, after being commanded to, sent 2 strong campaigns out into the field. One of them attacked the Jicarilla in the north, and the other attacked the Mescalero in the Sacramento Mountains. These cavalry troopers were scouring through the heart of Mescalero Apache land, looking for them Apache murderers, cattle thieves, raiders, just anyone that they could get their hands on that looked unpleasant. They marched from the Rio Grande through the mountains, the Sacramento Mountains, eastwards towards the Pecos River. Essentially, they went from Las Cruces to like Alamogordo, Ruidoso to Roswell. The soldiers then headed south down the Pecos River, which is the western boundary of the Llano Estacado, and then they headed east again towards Cloudcroft from Artesia along the Penasco River. They were on the hunt. During their march, as the men ascended the mountains to almost 9,000 feet, a heavy snow-covered ground confronted them. They were losing nearly a dozen horses a day. And then a skirmish erupted that saw Captain Stanton and 2 of his troopers killed. 15 Apaches lost their lives, though. The troopers chased the Mescalero, but eventually they had to turn back in the intense cold and wind. On their way back down, a trooper Bennett would write what they saw in his journal. Quote, "Came to where we buried Captain Stanton and the 2 men, found the bodies torn from the grave, their blankets stolen, bodies half eaten by wolves, their eyes picked out by ravens. Revolting sight. We built a large pile of pine wood, put on the bodies, burned the flesh, took the bones away." End quote. After the chase, the Mescalero were frightened, badly beaten, and hungry. They had no other option than to sue for peace with the governor, using Steck as their mouthpiece. In June of 1855, Governor Merriweather met with the Mescalero, their warriors, wives, and all of their hungry families. He wrote of them, quote, "I found these Indians in the most destitute condition imaginable. I believed their immediate wants and directed Agent Steck to issue them a limited amount of provisions, from time to time, as they might apply for relief and their necessities seemed to require it." End quote. When it came down to it, the Apache only raided because they had no other way to feed themselves. So when the government gave them rations, they calmed down. When the rations were rescinded, just as had happened in New Spain and Mexico, the Apache became violent and raided yet again, lest they starve. Maybe this would never have happened if nobody had moved into their lands and were competing with them for food, but who knows? 1856 saw rebel mescalero bands attack out of the beautiful Davis Mountains of far west Texas. Mountains I just drove through on my way to Big Bend in May of 2024. They are a truly beautiful mountain sky island in the harsh West Texas area. They are named after Jefferson Davis, as well as the town there. These mescalero were led by the rebel chief Gomez, the one who had caused the earlier strife with the army and the mescaleros. Also that year saw Western Apache attack Anglo settlements in the newly acquired Arizona land. They hailed from the Mogollon Rim. They also attacked Zuni Puebloans and Navajo sheep herders. It seemed they were on the warpath, and no one in their way was spared. Not even the son of a U.S. senator. John Upton Tyrrell sums up that unfortunate incident. I'll let him tell it. Quote, Major H.L. Kendrick was sent with a cavalry contingent to track them down. With the troops was Henry Lynn Dodge, Navajo agent, who had been extremely successful in holding the Navajos in line. Dodge, a former Army captain, was the son of Senator Henry Dodge of Wisconsin and a brother of Senator Augustus Caesar Dodge of Iowa. He was a staunch friend of the Navajo, had married a Navajo squaw, and was thoroughly trusted and highly respected by all the tribe, except a few outlaws. While hunting deer near Zuni, Dodge was ambushed and killed by a group of Apache stock thieves. End quote. Representatives of the U.S. Marshals at this time estimated that in a period of 5 years, the Apache stole from the properties in the territory of New Mexico approximately 450,000 sheep, 13,000 mules, 7,000 horses, and 32,000 horned cattle. The White Eyes were destined to punish the Apache for this alone. And I will get back to the U.S. Army's response to punishing the Apache for that murder of Dodge. Only 2 years after acquiring the land, in 1856, the town of Tubac, which is south of Tucson, and which was the headquarters for a promising new venture that was known at the time as the Sonora Exploring and Mining Company. Well, that town of Tubac, by 1856, had 1,000 residents. 1,000 people meant a lot of loot for raiding Apache, although they wouldn't molest the Americans yet. After all, these lumbermen and miners and ranchers and tough men, they were all well-armed Americans in a dangerous land. One American, Charles Poston, would comment rather illuminatingly on this subject. This is from Paul Andrew Hutton's The Apache Wars. Quote, Every man went about heavily armed. Generally worthless, dissipated, dangerous, low, white trash, was how Poston characterized the few Americans in the area. Still, Poston felt as if he had founded a frontier Eden. Quote, We had no law but love, and no occupation but labor, no government, no taxes, no public debt, no politics. It was a community in a perfect state of nature. End all quotes. Sign me up. Charles Poston is described in Edwin Sweeney's Mangas Coloradas as being simply a capitalist. But Paul Andrew Hutton calls him the self-styled father of Arizona. It was his company, the Sonora Exploring and Mining Company, that had been the economic boon for Tubac. It was also at his insistence that Jeff Davis sent dragoons to Tucson. But as he was heading to Arizona, he met up with the agent Steck, who at that time was transporting corn to Mangas Coloradas. At Santa Rita del Cobre, Poston actually got to meet the aging giant warrior Apache, and Poston said he was a fine-looking chief. Poston and Steck would stay at the camp for weeks, actually. I imagine the stories told around that campfire were enthralling. Poston wrote later that they had a good time at the camp, and that at some point he and the other Americans, quote, exhibited our new firearms, which were then Sharp's rifles and Colt's revolvers, shot at marks, and drank tiswin, roasted venison, and made the Indians some presents. What they appreciated most was some matches, which they wrapped carefully in buckskin. End quote. That sounds like one heck of a party that I wish I'd been invited to. Poston also wrote about how the Apaches, after firing their rounds into trees from their guns, when they were doing target practice, they would then go to the trees and carve the bullets out of the trees. Because, quote, they were economists in ammunition if nothing else. End quote. At this old-time mountain men-style rendezvous, Poston asked Mangas Coloradas if he could please keep Poston and his large crew of Americans and Germans safe while they traveled to Arizona. Mangas agreed, but asked Poston and Steck to please not interfere with their war to the knife with Mexico. Everyone was in agreement. Poston later said of the Apaches, I have generally found the Indians willing to keep faith with the whites, if the whites will keep faith with them. End quote. That was certainly Steck's point of view as well. A funny ending to this little anecdote with Poston is that on this trip he brought quite a few tintype photographs of himself he'd had taken of him in a big city, New York City. During his time at the camp, he passed out some of these tintype pictures to the leaders of the various Apache groups that he came into contact with. And then, later in life, Paul Andrew Hutton writes, quote, he would learn from an Apache woman that a band of warriors lying in ambush had spared him because their leader carried his tintype. End quote. Now remind me to start passing out my business card more often.